Hello and welcome back to this video series on object-oriented programming in Java. In this video, I'd like to briefly discuss two things. One is this thing called a constructor, and also a method called the Tostring Method, and how we can use that to be the string representation for our class. So in this case here, we'll focus primarily on overloading constructors and then give some practical use cases, and we'll go back to our example we've been using throughout these videos and implement a constructor and overload, and also an overloaded constructor. And we'll make use of a toString method as well. And I may, if time permits, we may look at doing an example of a working method. So let's skip ahead here. So constructors, what are constructors? What is the purpose of a constructor? So here's an example of a class where we have 4 attributes, 4 properties: interest, gender, age, name. These are all set to public. But then you'll see that here we have something called public person, which is the same name as the class. And then we also have the same thing as well here, where my mouse is hovering, public person. But this one is accepting or defining parameters for this constructor. So these are 2 examples of constructors. And the short definition for constructors is that it's another way to set information on behalf of the object. And so previously we would use these set methods. We don't have them in this class here, but we use these set methods here to set information on behalf of the class. So if we go to, let's say, renter, we have the set name, we have the set email, the set move-in date, and so forth. But another way to set information on behalf of the class is to call the constructor, and we can define certain parameters that we want to pass into that constructor, such as we have on for this particular example here, where we're defining string interest, string gender, and age, string name. Now, by default, a constructor is automatically called whenever you create an object instance, or an instance of an object instance. And so if we look at our code here, we go back to our app.java. When we say renter1 equals new renter, we're actually calling what we call the default constructor. And that's something that we don't define automatically in our class. It's automatically, let's say that it's already automatically embedded in our class structure. When we don't actually type it out, it's something that's already there for us that we can actually call upon. And when we use the new keyword, it's creating a new object instance, and it's reserving memory on something called the heap. Now, we're not going to get into the heap and the stack in this video, but just know that when we use this new keyword, it's reserving space in another location to hold the information for an object instance. So let's take a look at defining a constructor in our class using an example that we've been using in these videos here. And again, you can use this to refer to. This is essentially how we would define a default constructor. And in this example here, they're setting some default information for interest for this attribute or property. So when this default constructor is set, if interest is not set when you're setting the information for that object instance, it would automatically receive the text forthcoming. So in our example here, how do you set, or how do you create a constructor? Let's go to our renter. I'm going to make a comment here. And I'm going to first define the default constructor. And again, without us having to define a default constructor, this is already given to us within the class structure itself. But we're going to redefine the default constructor in this case here, because we're going to have multiple constructors. And so we're going to say public, and then it's always going to be the name of the class. And so in this case, it's going to be renter, and then open and close bracket, and that's our default constructor. If we wanted to, we could set some default values for this. We could say this dot name is going to be equal to, let's say, let's put everything as NA, not available. And then email, let's just say NA, right? So let's just do 2 of these for now, and instead of actually populating all of this here. And And let's go ahead and output a renter object instance. So I'm going to save this. And one of the other things I want to introduce you to is something called a toString method. And a toString method is the string representation for a class. And I usually define my toString method typically at the bottom. And I have a slide for that. So here, if we go to the slide, I'm not sure if I have a toString represented here, but let me scroll over. So here's an example of a toString method at the bottom here, where we say public string toString. Now, toString comes from a base class called object in Java. And so it inherits this method called toString. Now you're saying, Chris, what are you talking about that it inherits this method called toString? I thought we defined a method such as bio and greeting. But where is this toString method being inherited from? It's been being inherited from a base class called object. And so if we were to go back to, let me save this here before I move on. If we go to our app.java and we were to say, let's just go ahead and say render1 dot. See, here we have all the various methods that are available to us that's defined in our class. We have get city, get class, get email, get move-in date, get name, get preferred bath count. But then there's some other methods here that we did not define. Where did those come from? So for instance, hash code, notify all. And then we have toString. That's not defined in our method, but where are those coming from? That's coming from a base class called object. And every particular class that we create, it inherits from this base class called object. And we can override these methods. And that's what we're going to do with the toString method. And we're using the toString method so that we can output or give string representation for our class. So for instance, if we want the renter to, if we want to just output the information for each renter object instance that we create, we can define a class or method called toString to do that. So for quicker iteration, I'm going to copy this method here, and I'll just paste it in. And then I'm going to put my string representation for this class. And so I would say, again, don't overthink it. It's just basically the string representation for our class. So I'll just output the, let's see here, the name. Oops, and I meant to put this as email. Name and email. Okay, so now if we save this and we go back to our class here, and what I'm going to do here is comment this out for a quick moment, and comment this out. And I'm actually going to comment out all of this here. And I'm going to call on the toString method. This to show you that first, that we can output information that we define by default for our default constructor. So if we don't set anything for our constructor, such as for a render object instance, it's going to automatically give the name the value of NA, and then email the value of NA. So let's go ahead and call the toString method, which should output the name and the email. And we should get name NA, email NA. So here, let's just do a system.out print line and just call this renter1. And whenever you want to output the toString method, you can just basically output the name of the method or the name of the object. In this case, it's called renter1. And so that'll automatically output the toString, or call upon a toString method to output the string representation for that class. So if we save that and then we press the play button, whoops, I think we have one small error here on line 78. Let's see here. Yep, closing bracket for the toString method. There we go. So if we save that and then run it again, here we go, right? We get the hello renter, and that's coming from this line on line 4. But then here, we're calling the default constructor, which is on line 7, new renter. And remember, we set the name and email to NA. And so in this case here, these are the default values that get assigned, or the properties that get assigned NA whenever we call this default constructor. Now, typically we will typically set information for each object instance, but if we were to ever call renter and didn't set anything, it'll automatically set the values to the values that we set within the constructor. Now, there's one more thing I want to talk about here. It's called we can overload a constructor. And so overload the constructor here is basically given the same name as an example of polymorphism. So we can say public renter, so same name, but this time here, what's going to distinguish it is that we're going to define some parameters that we're going to pass in. And so in this case here, we're going to pass in the move-in date. I'll define a move-in date here. So I'll say string move date, and I'll just do preferred city, preferred region. In this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the move date and the preferred region to our class properties. And so whatever we pass in through this constructor, I'll set it for that object instance, set the properties for that object instance. And so I'll say move-in date. It's going to be equal to move date that we're passing in, whatever is passed in through that constructor. And then here I'll say preferred region is equal to pre-region. I'm going to do one more here just as a quick example. Let's define another parameter here that we could pass in. I'm going to say city. I want to give it the same name as our property. Now, when you have something such as this, when your parameter is the same name as your property, you want to use this keyword to distinguish between the class property and the parameter that we're defining. So we'll say this city equals city. And that's what's just going to distinguish between what we're passing in versus the property of the class. So now we have a default constructor, and we can have multiple default constructors. So if I want to go down and have another constructor that defines everything that we want to pass in for every attribute that we want to set for this class, we can do that, right? And what's the use case for this? The use case for this is that sometimes you only want to get certain information when you create these object instances. And so you can create a constructor that would only accept certain information. So for instance, let's say that you had an application for a higher education institution. These students, if they're a student athlete, they only need to input their first and last name, right? Or if you had a student who's a scholar or an academic scholarship, they need to put in their GPA, first name and last name to create their instance or to create their record in the system. And so it helps you just have many different ways of creating an object instance and only accepting certain values when you create those object instances. Last but not least, let's go ahead and save this and let's run this program just to demonstrate that we can have multiple constructors defined and call that we can pass information in. So we go back to our program here, and this time here, I am going to, for renter 2, I'm going to pass in some information. I'm going to pass in a move-in date. I'll say May 3rd. And I'll do the pre-region, preferred region, which is going to be, let's say, West. And then the last thing is going to be city, and I'll just say, let's say Chicago. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to just, so that I can actually see the stream representation, the output of this class, I'm going to add those three things here. And so I'll just say plus preferred region. And again, this is just me just using that Tostring method to output information. And then I'll just do one more here, which is going to be move date. All right, so that's going to save both of those. And then here I have renter 1. I'll keep that in there, and then I'll just output renter 2. And for renter 2, we should still get NA for name, NA for email. Oh, actually, we won't get that. It's just that we won't have a name or an email. So in this case here, let's actually fix something here. Let's do this here. For our default constructor, or for our overloaded constructor, let me put a comment here. I am going to set a value for name, not set, and this dot email. And the reason why I'm setting a value is because of my toString method. I want some information to be output, and I just say not set yet. Okay, so let's save that, and then now let's run this in our code. Let's run our program. And here we go, right? So we called the first one here. The first region and date is null because we didn't set a value for our default constructor. But then here for renter 2, it's not set. For name, email is not set. Preferred region is west. And I could have spaced that out a little bit more, but you get the point. So in this video, like I said, we just wanted to practice with this idea of implementing a constructor. Again, here's a default constructor. Here's an overloaded constructor. We can have many different constructors. It's just a different way of setting information on behalf of the class. But then also, we also talked about this idea of a toString method. It's inherited from a base class called object, and it's basically the string representation for a class. If we didn't have this particular method and didn't override the base class method or the object class method, it would just output the memory address of the object. So stay tuned. This wraps up this video on constructors and toString. Stay tuned for the next video.